So good evening, and my name is Julie Chen. I am the director of the Medical Ethics and Humanities Unit at the Clinical School of Medicine at the University of Hong Kong, and on behalf of the three organizing parties, that is the Medical Ethics and Humanities Unit, the Center for Medical Ethics and Law at the University of Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine, I would like to welcome those of you who are here in person. Thank you so much for coming, and also the 380 plus people that we have online as well. So I think this is testament to the immense interest in the topic that we're going to be discussing today in this Medical Ethics and Law Symposium that will examine the thorny issue of adolescent consent for their own medical care. So we'll begin this symposium with a keynote address, followed by a moderated response and discussion from a panel that is comprised of colleagues with diverse areas of expertise, including clinical practice, medical ethics, medical law, and we'll also have the perspective of a medical student who is not so far removed from adolescence himself. So all of whom I will introduce in due course. So to begin, it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, who is here as the external advisor to our Medical Ethics and Humanities Unit. Professor Mark Cherry is the Dr. Patricia A. Hayes Professor in Applied Ethics and Professor of Philosophy at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. His research encompasses ethics and bioethics, together with social and political philosophy. He is editor of the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy and senior editor of the journal Christian Bioethics, both published by Oxford University Press. And he is editor-in-chief of the journal Healthcare Ethics Committee Forum. He has a forthcoming book called Bioethics After God, Morality, Culture, and Medicine out of the University of Notre Dame Press to be published in August 2024, as well as numerous edited books, journal articles, book chapters, and other publications. Professor Cherry's talk this evening is entitled, "Should Adolescents Be Permitted to Consent to Their Own Medical Care? How the West Gets It Wrong." Please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Cherry.
Y'all, it's a great joy to be with you here in Hong Kong once again. I really look forward to talking about this topic with you and having an interesting and engaging conversation. What I'm going to look at today is to try to offer a view beyond that which would narrow the role of parents to simply looking out for acting as sort of custodians of their adolescents' best interests in that fashion. In many Western countries, including Western Europe, much of Western Europe and Canada, there has been an attempt to remove so-called mature minors, that is to say, those who are under the age of 18, but whom the doctor thinks of as adequately mature, insofar as one can understand that concept, away from the authority of their parents, and instead to think of them as isolated from their parents to make their own medical decisions. And part of what I'm going to try to explore with you today are the ways in which this is probably not an ideal solution and way to move forward. In part, let's see if I figure out PowerPoints. There we go. Despite psychological and neurophysiological evidence demonstrating the ongoing development of the adolescent brain, influential members of the medical constituencies in the Western world act as if so-called mature minors, that is, individuals who are still children under the age of 18, possess adult capacities for rational, mature choice and personal agency. Advocates seek to augment the participation rights of children in pediatric medical decision-making, especially insofar as the child appears to that particular physician to demonstrate intellectual understanding, grasp of the circumstances, and reasonable maturity. In many Western countries, such as Canada and much of Western Europe, minor children are themselves being put forward as autonomous decision-makers with basic rights of self-determination. As this presentation will explore in more depth, however, adolescents, even so-called mature minors, often lack adequate development of the intellectual, affective, and emotional capacities necessary morally to consent to medical treatment on their own behalf. While it's absolutely true that adolescents' intellectual and affective capacities to understand and appreciate information increases dramatically together with physical development, effectively increasing the capacity of relatively mature minors to choose in ways that would appear to support their own long-term interests, as well as plausible accounts of their own basic interests. The adolescent's ability effectively and adequately to envision the consequences of important decisions is limited by the turmoil of adolescence, immature emotional responses, and a relatively incomplete capacity to appreciate the consequences of choices that reach beyond the immediate future. Such psychological observations are further supported with neurophysiological imaging studies on the physical development of the adolescent brain that demonstrate the relative immaturity of the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, as compared to the limbic system, the source of emotional and pleasure-oriented short-term response. For example, in emotionally charged circumstances, the more mature limbic system dominates the less fully developed prefrontal cortex. Parental authority and family-based consent here play a central role in protecting adolescents from the full impact of their choices. Parents and families essentially play a very important role as the proper guides in the development of the decisional capacity of adults that their children will eventually become. In short, the weight of the psychological and neurophysiological data regarding brain maturation supports the conclusion that adolescents are qualitatively different types of agents than mature adults. They lack full adult maturity and personal agency. In response to the move to liberate children from the parental authority, I support an account of a more family-based medical decision-making. So we'll look at some background information. So individual informed consent, and here I'm just going to use the United States as the example to give us a sense of what's going on and what's at stake. In the United States, the practice of free and voluntary informed consent to medical care reflects a number of moral considerations regarding individually focused autonomy, the authority of persons over themselves, and the challenge of knowing what it means to choose correctly in a morally pluralistic society like the United States. Adults are usually understood as the best judges of their own best interests, as well as of how those interests can or ought to be realized. As Justice Cardozo noted in Schlondorf versus Society of New York Hospital in 1914, quote, "Every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his body," end quote. So informed consent in the United States generally requires that individuals have sufficient cognitive capacity and effective agency to give permission to participate. Meaningful consent combines at least three different components: an intellectual component, that is the ability to understand and appreciate significant information. Second, an affective component, that is the ability to appreciate how such information applies to oneself and to one's long-term interests. So when the doctor gives the information, it's not just intellectual information, it's that information actually applies to me. Right? So in the sense of how it will impact me and my long-term interests. As well as third, the idea of sufficient personal agency. That is, the mature ability to choose either to participate or to refuse to do so, and the practical ability to follow through on one's choice. Free and voluntary informed consent asks a great deal of the intellectual, emotional, and self-governing capacities of individuals. It is challenging enough to demonstrate that one has met such standards with regard to adult competent decision makers. The difficulties are even more significant with minor children who typically live at home with their parents or other family members and are not yet fully morally or legally responsible for themselves. So parents are usually identified within very broad side constraints as in authority over their minor children, and as the best judges for how to balance costs and benefits, how to inculcate moral virtues and which moral virtues are relevant, and to articulate proper lifestyle choices for themselves and their children. There has generally existed the normative presumption that absent emergencies or other exigent circumstances, medical treatment of minor children should occur with the consent of the parents or other adult family members. Recently, however, activists have sought to move away from traditional understandings of parental and familial authority to shift law and public policy in ways that undermine the presumption that parents ought to make such decisions regarding their own minor children. Advocates have sought to reconceptualize minor children as morally in authority over themselves and as the best judges of their own best interests, so as to motivate a concomitant shift in law and public policy. Some commentators claim that children possess basic rights over themselves, and as a result should be understood as possessing greater authority to make their own lifestyle choices based on the child's own moral values and personal interests, independent of the wishes of their parents. So as a quick example, I have colleagues in Canada who are part of their process for active euthanasia, where they engage in actually the killing of patients under certain circumstances. And they have begun arguing that a mature minor ought to be able to choose to be euthanized even if the parents think otherwise. Now that's a very dramatic change and shift in authority. Let's see. Here I give you the working group, a quote from the working group, the Confederation of European Specialists in Pediatrics. They argued, and I'll just read the quote, "Younger children may, according to the laws of individual states, be able to consent to treatment, especially if they have enough maturity and ability to understand the benefits and risks of the proposed treatment and its alternatives. This concept of a mature minor has been introduced by some authorities to include groups of children whose age ranges in most EU countries from 14 to 18 years, and who are often regarded as being mature enough to give their own consent to treatment. In some countries, the age at which children are considered to be potentially competent is even lower. In some jurisdictions, competent minors can give their consent without the involvement of parents, assuming the decision is beneficial for the adolescent and he or she does not want the parents involved. In any case, doctors should always question themselves if the child is mature enough to give consent or assent. So one of the puzzles I always raise when I think about this kind of issue is I think about my sons. I have 3 sons, the youngest of whom is 19, and I remember back to when they were 14 and whether they were good at remembering to brush their teeth. Now, think back to when you were 14, think of the kinds of decisions you made, how brilliant and wonderful and perfect they were at 14, and whether you were really in a good position to be making very significant decisions about your future without parental guidance, without guidance of one's family. What has been referred to as the Gillick test in England establishes criteria for determining whether children under 16 years of age have the capacity to consent. And I'll read you this quote. I don't think I have that one. In clinical practice, this means assessing whether a young person can understand and appraise the nature, purpose, and implications of treatment, any risks there might be, and any alternate courses of action and their consequences. In making the assessment, it is necessary to consider emotional maturity, intellectual capacity, and psychological state. The Canadian Pediatric Society supports a similar stance. Again, I'll just read you their quote. There we go. The Canadian Pediatric Society has taken a stand that decisions involving children should be made in collaboration with the children, their parents, and members of the healthcare team. Once it is determined that children have the capacity to make decisions which entails full understanding of the situation and fully grasping the main purpose of interventions, the consequences of consent, and the overall extent of what could occur, they should be the primary decision makers, end quote. Even within the intensive care setting, advocates urge that physicians should seriously consider seeking the what they call informed permission of adolescents regarding the direction of their treatment. Others conclude that adolescents should be able to consent on their own behalf to certain types of research clinical trials, and more generally to medical treatment independent of their parents. Some advocates argue that even end-of-life decisions, such as refusing cancer treatment or refusing heart transplant, and as I mentioned, even including active euthanasia, should be left up to the judgment of what they determine to be sufficiently mature minors. Parents and physicians are told under these circumstances to advise and work more or less as equals with such minor children, who are appreciated as possessing the moral authority to make final decisions. Here, the child's participation rights in medical decisions are appreciated as having greater standing insofar as the child appears to demonstrate more maturity. Minor children who demonstrate what they think of as adequate maturity, it is urged, ought to be appreciated as having rights to confidentiality and healthcare treatment in accordance with their own wishes. Such a conclusion urges a shift away from recognizing any particular age threshold as presumptively indicating adult decision-making capacity to instead recognizing minor children whom physicians and other healthcare workers judge to be sufficiently mature as in authority over themselves and as the best judges of their own best interests, and thus is able to consent to medical care on their own behalf, even if the parents disagree or other adult family members. Regarding areas of life that are deemed private, children are now often identified as independent of their parents and families even prior to have necessarily achieved any serious maturity. Advocates argue that sufficiently mature minors should be permitted decide on their own behalf regarding such matters as contraception, sexual practices with consenting others, and treatment for sexually transmitted diseases. Even controversial procedures such as abortion are often left up to the child. So rather than being appreciated as within the authority of their parents or other adult family members, minor children are appreciated, anticipated as moving as quickly as feasible from giving assent to medical treatment, where they would be together with parents and other family members in a conversation, because you need to teach children how to make good decisions and they'd be part of the conversation, have a sense of it, but instead to move away from that to giving independent consent and as having moral and legal authority over against their own parents. For many in the Western world, children are being appreciated as within parental authority only insofar as the parents act as trustees of what are seen to be the child's best interests, and as long as the child has not become sufficiently mature. The goal is for children to exercise their own personal autonomy and self-determination to define their own understandings of proper moral choice and personal values. Children, especially those judged to be mature minors, are to act as fully authoritative participants in medical decision-making as soon as possible. It is the mature minor who is appreciated as in authority over himself and, as I mentioned, is the best judge of his own best interests, and is able to consent to even dangerous or life-altering medical treatment on his own behalf. What I do in the next section is look at the adolescent brain as a work in progress. I'll be painting in somewhat broad strokes, don't want to bore people with all kinds of too many details, but I want to give you a general sense of what's taking place. And it's obvious that individuals mature at various rates, with developing capacity for understanding and appreciating pertinent information. It is unclear why either physicians, so even though while all of that's true, it's surely unclear why either physicians or medical researchers should be permitted to act on their own judgments regarding the child's sufficient maturity to consent to medical care on their own behalf, independent of the actual consent of the child's parents. In part, it is difficult to provide a satisfactory assessment of the child's actual decision-making capacity. The need for reliable and valid capacity assessment tools is very real. Further research is needed in this area. Assessment tools often have significant limitations, and there is a lack of agreement regarding the relevant standards of properly assessing such capacities. As one of my colleagues, Anna Iltis, points out, in the context of medical research participation, she says, quote, "It may be impossible to fulfill satisfactorily the requirement that decisional capacity can be measured, at least in some instances in which minors will be allowed to consent to research participation, because there is no adequate instrument for such assessment. Insofar as claims about authority over themselves turn on capacity, it is important to have a robust notion of what criteria must be met to have capacity and to know how to assess it," end quote. In the absence of accurate methods for assessing whether adolescents have capacity sufficiently to understand and appreciate the relevant information, and to make a free and really voluntary choice to participate in medical research, the findings that a mature minor is able to make appropriate decisions on his own may simply reflect the biases and interests of the medical team. There is, for example, a significant and growing body of scientific data that the adolescent brain is not yet fully developed in its cognitive or affective capacities. Parts of the developing adolescent brain do not reach mature adult proportions until sometime well after 18 years of age. Consequently, among the challenges for permitting adolescents to consent on their own behalf to participate in sophisticated and sometimes risky medical research or medical treatment is that the adolescent brain is still a work in progress. It's developing. Neurophysiological imaging studies demonstrate, for example, that parts of the brain associated with executive function develop slowly through adolescence into the early and middle 20s. Such functions include cognitive faculties that support planning, inhibition, mental flexibility, reasoning, problem solving, experience of reward and punishment, self-regulation of behavior, and careful decision making. The prefrontal cortex, which is important for cognition and reasoning, for controlling impulses and emotional responses, continues to develop, slowly maturing into adult dimensions, even during the 20s. The prefrontal cortex control systems are, however, essential for overriding inappropriate or impulsive choices and for the long-term planning of goal-directed decisions. More generally, the areas of the brain that are utilized for the realization of responsible and reasonable choices are amongst the last to reach adult-sized development. Such structural differences between the adult and the adolescent brain are strongly correlated with adverse outcomes, including increased risk of taking behavior, such as experimentation with risky sexual practices, drugs, alcohol, and gambling. Adolescents have an increased incidence of injury, unintended pregnancy, sexually transmitted disease, homicide, suicide, and other forms of violent and impulsive behavior. Insofar as you have children who have a driver's license and you're required to have insurance premiums for teenage boys in particular, I only have boys, so I can only talk about boys, is horrible. It's just stunningly expensive to insure teenage boys. And the insurance companies are just tracking the statistical data on the way in which young men drive. I'm cheap to insure on a much more expensive car because I'm old and boring. And I have a much more developed brain, and I'm not thinking about how to drive in crazy ways to impress other people, right? Imaging studies have demonstrated that the brain continues dynamically to change throughout adolescence and into adulthood, with a late full maturation of the frontal lobes. And here I'll just read a quote for you. These findings suggest distinct neurobiological trajectories for impulse versus risk-taking behavior. The limbic subcortical systems appear to be developed by adolescents in contrast to control systems that show a protracted and linear developmental course into young adulthood. The prefrontal cortical control systems are necessary for overriding inappropriate choices and actions in favor of goal-directed ones, end quote. These areas of the brain are necessary for effective use of executive functions, for self-control over short-term impulses, and in favor of long-term goal-directed decision-making. For example, MRI studies demonstrate increased subcortical activation when individuals make risky choices or processes emotional information. This reaction is heightened in adolescence as compared to younger children or mature adults. The consequences of the relative immaturity of the prefrontal cortex when compared to the limbic system include a relatively immature capacity adequately to appreciate long-term implications of one's choices, a greater focus on pleasure-oriented short-term outcomes, and increased risk-taking behavior. Again, consider, for example, the apparent contradiction between adolescents' obvious abilities to engage in acute observation. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to show you the quote. Acute observation, rational thinking, including mathematics and logical analysis, and intellectual discussion with their immature exercise of personal agency, such as their known high-risk behavior. While some earlier studies claim that adolescents as young as 14 or 15 years of age possess roughly the same decision-making capacity as adults, as Lawrence Steinberg has argued, from 1990 through 2010, the empirical studies just started to change dramatically in focus and conclusions. Researchers began to test not merely intellectual information, but the ways in which judgment is affected by social and emotional capacities as well. So just give you another quote to look at. The studies begin to argue that factors such as impulse control, susceptibility to social influence, and the appraisal of risk and reward interacted with logical reasoning ability, sometimes leading adolescents to make decisions that were not as mature as those made by adults. Moreover, decision-making under real-life conditions where consequences were not hypothetical revealed significant differences between typical adolescent and mature adult choices. The difference between adolescent and adult decision-making is exacerbated when emotional and social influences are heightened. Steinberg concludes, and I'll read a quote, "There is now incontrovertible evidence that adolescence is a period of significant changes in brain structure and function. The most important conclusion to emerge from this research is that important changes in brain anatomy and activity take place far longer into development than has been previously thought, in some respects into the early and mid-20s. Relatively immature social and emotional capacities negatively impact adolescent judgment. As a result, especially in emotionally charged circumstances, or when under the influence of others, such as peer pressure or adult authorities, the more developed limbic system tends to hold sway over the prefrontal cortex. In summary, adolescents demonstrate a heightened responsiveness to the immediacy of short-term rewards over long-term gains. That's why they want to play video games instead of writing their philosophy papers, for example. A documented enhancement of sensation-seeking, leading to increased risky decision-making without sufficient consideration of long-term consequences, an immature sense of responsibility, an incompletely formed personal character, and an enhanced vulnerability to outside pressure, including peer pressure, as well as pressure from physicians and medical researchers. Adolescents may often know better, may even be able to rehearse probable costs and benefits associated with various actions, but very routinely be driven to make a different and perhaps riskier choice given the emotional context, such as the desire to please an authority figure or an immature perception of how such risk applies to oneself. This relative immaturity of adolescent cognitive and affective control is correlated with adverse outcomes, especially when adolescents engage in decision-making unguided by parents or other adult members. Even the supposedly mature adolescent, who has the ability to understand risky behavior and to reason about proper choice in real-world circumstances, routinely possesses insufficiently mature emotional or cognitive personality to refrain from such behavior. So we'll just look at a few additional costs, risk assessment, and conflicts of interest. Arguments in favor of permitting adolescents to exercise their own judgments to make medical decisions over against their parents and other adult family members often fail adequately to distinguish between intellectual and affective components of consent to medical treatment, much less sufficiently to recognize the necessity of effective personal agency. There is no clear correlation between an adolescent's intellectual abilities and that adolescent's effective executive capacity to make mature judgments. All three of my sons learned how to do calculus when they were 16 and 17, and yet they still made decisions the way that adolescents make decisions, right? It's just different parts of the brain. Let's see. The risk of coercion, for example, or morally inappropriate undue influence can easily exist in the medical environment. It can be challenging enough for fully mature adults to walk away from physicians who appear to be offering beneficial treatment, but who may be attempting to manipulate patients in inappropriate ways. Children, including adolescents, are socialized to follow instructions and to adapt to adult wishes and expectations. This includes not just parents and other family members, but other adults perceived as being an authority: teachers, administrators, coaches, police officers, nurses, doctors, and so forth. Adolescents have much less control over their social and physical environment than do adults. Adolescents generally lack the freedom easily to extract themselves from the settings in which medicine occurs, which might be a doctor's office, a hospital, or other healthcare setting, or even their school, which may have a medical clinic. In addition to questions regarding capacity, this risk of undue influence, together with a lack of easy retreat and exit, also threatens the likelihood that adolescents' consent is actually free and voluntary. Just as a kind of a different example, in Texas, there are basically two religions, high school football and high school marching band. Right? And they're both run by individuals who think that they themselves are God, the coach and the band director. And neither one cares that much officially about whether the kids do well in their other classes, except insofar as it impacts their ability to play football or be on the marching team. Now, they always claim otherwise, but their behavior does not necessarily suggest that they're really thinking about the child's future so much as the next game or the next band competition. What that means is, and children find it very difficult under the circumstances to do other than try to please the authority figure. Part of the role of the parent is to stand between the child and the authority figure and say things like, no, that isn't going to happen. That dog don't hunt no how, as they say in Texas. And make it difficult, make it easier for the child to step away from the kinds of decisions that they need to make. Families are in a much better position to protect the interests of children, including adolescents. The data belie previous projections of adolescents as adults in all but age. The false projections of children which are being relied on to shape efforts at law and public policy to undermine the authority of parents and families, I think, should just be abandoned. The data simply do not support acting as if adolescents under the age of 18 really do possess mature decisional capacities and granting every younger adolescent greater decision-making authority over key aspects of their lives. Adolescents are just qualitatively different types of agents than adult persons. The overwhelming data supports regarding the ongoing development and slow maturation process of the brain just don't support this concept of a mature minor as a fully formed, autonomous, mature decision maker. The so-called mature minor standard, at best, presents an idealized sense of adolescents still underdeveloped and immature decision-making capacities. Consequently, advocates who continue to support the mature minor standard must be appreciated as intentionally, I don't know, ignoring or denying what appear to be brute facts regarding the limited ability of adolescents to exercise reasonable and responsible executive decision-making, including the poor adolescent outcomes regarding such things as car accidents, alcohol and drug use, sexually transmitted disease, and other risky and violent behavior. Moreover, such an idealized image of adolescent autonomy stands in direct conflict with the long-term good of the adults those adolescents are destined to become. Indeed, insofar as the data suggest any conclusion, they support an even greater appreciation of children and older adolescents as properly set within decision-making authority of their parents and families. Given the adolescents' inability adequately to envision the long-term consequences of decisions, parents continue to play an important role in guiding and protecting their children during a period of intellectual, physical, and emotional development when the decision-making capacity is still developing and they're not yet ready to take on the role in the world as a mature adult. As a result, trends in pediatric decision-making in support of a mature minor always seem to me to constitute moral and legal movement in the wrong direction, opposite to what the science bearing on the matter demonstrates to be reasonable. Parents, and then just a brief conclusion, parents and other adult family members play a central role in helping to protect adolescents from the full force of their decision. This role includes protecting adolescents from the undue influence of other adults who might wish to use children to achieve goals that might not be fully aligned with the child's long-term interests, such as medical researchers who may pressure adolescents to join or to remain within a research study, or physicians who may be pushing an adolescent towards medical choices in support of that physician's preferred social, political, or moral interests. While Western commentators often conceive of the family as no more than a culturally conditioned social construction, Such a conception is one-sided and incomplete at best. The family is usually experienced as a morally regulative category of social life, as well as a biological fact of the matter. The family is the biologically based community where men and women create long-term social units for companionship and procreation, preserving and allocating resources, as well as preferentially caring for children, adults, and elderly or members of the family. The family is the structure within which persons generally come into being, live, and raise children. It sustains its own goals, interests, and understandings of human flourishing. Moreover, the family possesses its own ontological status in the sense of not simply being appreciated as a nexus of relations, attractions, undertakings, but in fact as a social reality. The human family is central to our experience and consciousness of that social reality. It is the way we think the unity of the persons along with their relations who are the reality of the family. Appreciating the family in this fashion provides a foundational condition for the possibility of being conscious of, as well as experiencing and appreciating a major domain of human experience. The category of family is amongst the most basic ways that thought apprehends the social being of humans. To focus unduly on the individual in isolation from the family, such as the supposedly mature adolescent, is really to diminish this rich and significant category of human good. It tends to drive a wedge between parents and children in ways that routinely is not in the long-term interest of children. In short, parents and other family members are routinely in a much better position to judge the relative maturity and long-term interests of adolescents than medical professionals who may have spent very little time with a child and who do not have long-term commitments to that child or that child's long-term flourishing. The evidence strongly supports the conclusion that parental participation is essential to guide, augment, and train adolescent decision-making. Unlike the medical team, families have a unique stake in the adolescent's well-being. One might think of family engagement like other types of cases in which various stakeholders are consulted. Perhaps even more importantly, parents are morally responsible for their children. As a result, the risks that minors undertake impose obligations on their parents. If adolescents are permitted to consent to participation in medical decisions on their own, and if such choices cause harm, the parents would very likely find themselves responsible for taking care of the injuries. Parental authority, including consent to medical treatment, is coupled with responsibility. The parents who are authorizing treatment are also those individuals who are usually obliged to pay for such care or to take care of the challenges which come from it. Parents and other family members have significant interest in their children and are usually understood as those best suited to understand their children's best interests. Again, numerous studies have demonstrated the importance of authoritative and active parenting for advantaging children's emotional and social development, as well as helping their development of their adaptive and cognitive skills, including things like academic achievement, goal setting, long-term planning. Such active parenting helps adolescents develop into more effective and successful adults. It does not make sense to encourage the isolation of adolescents from their parents' authority and involvement in their lives. Right? Parents play an absolutely essential role in helping people do well long-term. And I then point you to a book I published back in 2015 where these kinds of issues are developed in much more detail, looking at all kinds of empirical data, as well as different ways in which we understand the family and its role in the world. Thank you all so much for your kindness. I look forward to our conversation. And we can turn this off. Oh, there's controls.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Professor Cherry, for giving us, much to consider as we proceed. So we're going to commence the next part of our symposium, which is the discussion part. And so as we're engaging in the discussion, for those of you who are online, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A box. And for those of you who are here in person, we will circulate with a a microphone if you have any questions. So I would like to introduce the moderator for the discussion part, who is Professor Eric Yip. He is a public health bioethicist and co-director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law at the University of Hong Kong, where he is also professor of law. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Socio-Legal Studies from the Faculty of Law at the University of Oxford and a Master of Bioethics from the Faculty of Medicine and Health. Professor Yip has also been awarded numerous teaching and research awards from Hong Kong U and also from his previous institution, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he served as Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Studies and Director of the LLB program. So let me turn it over to Professor Yip, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much, Julie, for your introduction. And thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Professor Cherry, for your enlightening keynote speech. This is surely a topic that deserves much more attention and thoughtful debate. My name is Eric Yip, and I am one of the two co-directors of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law at HKU, where I'm also a professor of law. And we're glad to have four discussants with us this evening. Professor Gilberto Leung is one of the is my medical counterpart, co-director of our Center for Medical Ethics and Law, as well as the president of this academy. Dr. James Chiu, who, like Professor Leung, is a co-chairman of the Professionalism and Ethics Committee of the Academy. So he'll come over. Department of Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine, and Mr. Ivan Lam, an MBBS student also from HKU Med. All right, so let's feel free to discuss issues relating to today's topic, and I'd like to invite every discussant to say a few words about your preliminary thoughts so that we've got a better foundation for discussion. And after Dr. Chiu comes back, he will give us a very short presentation on the Hong Kong position on this question. So Professor Leung, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today in person. And also thank you, those online, for joining. Thank you, sir, for your very enlightening and slightly controversial speech, appropriately controversial speech. As I mentioned earlier, there's no need for us to re-rehearse the mature minor legal doctrines here. I'm sure many of you know them well. Welcome, James. So if I can just kick off the question. Based on what you said, do you think, or do you not think that the age 18 or 21, depending on where you are, is necessarily a legal fiction? Because based on your biological analysis of how mental capacity or competency would develop over time or must develop over time, there is actually no clear dividing line between competency and the lack of it. And therefore, while we are arguing whether mature minor should be given the authority to decide for their own medical treatment, you can also argue whether there are immature adults that we should deprive them of such authority, because it is necessarily a continuum. So there are immature minor, immature adults, brain injury adults, psychiatric adults, alcoholic adults, demented adults. So in which case, we have to really do an assessment for all of them on a case-by-case basis, which is what Gillick was originally talking about. It's not saying that every children between 16 and 18 are competent. It is saying certain children at that age could be mentally competent under certain circumstances. So it's very context specific. So applying that concept and what you said, then you can argue that not all adults are competent at all times. It is context specific, and therefore we cannot presume adults to be competent until proven otherwise, which is what we do in medicine. This is what the lawyers would say. So I just want to know what's your take on that, as in breaking down that legal fiction and to apply your concept and say everyone should be assessed. It is wrong to presume that an adult is competent until proven otherwise. Just one.
So, first, it's absolutely true that nothing magic happens at 18, but that's easy. When each of my sons, the night before each of my sons turned 18, I went up to them and I said, at midnight, everything changes and nothing changes. And they said, thanks, Dad, you're a philosopher. You said nothing helpful, as usual. I said, you don't understand. And as of midnight, I can throw you out of the house and no one can stop me. And they won't be able to bring you back. And they sort of look at me like, what? And I says, as of midnight, you can walk away from me and never come back, and I can't stop you. I said, now, I don't want you to leave, and I hope you will stay, and I'm not planning to kick you out. But you need to understand things are now different, because all of that's possible. Now, so 18 provides a kind of a useful, even if incomplete account of when these kinds of things happen. That's what it's been used for. Right? What's interesting about the data is it does not suggest pushing decision-making earlier and earlier and earlier as if they were in fact adults. Instead, if it suggests anything, it suggests pushing it the other direction, pushing it the other way. So if we're going to take the data seriously and engage in the kind of assessments you're thinking about, it does push it the other way rather than younger. The next issue is, obviously you're right, adults don't always make good decisions. The idea of having a kind of a dividing line, as even if one thinks it's somewhat arbitrary at 18 or 21, is a way of saying at some point we have to presumptively treat you as if you were an adult, even though we know it's not always good to do so. We have to watch over you. So I'm a university professor. I teach undergraduates. Many of my students are 18, 19, 20, 21. And the difference between the 18-year-old brain and the 22-year-old brain when they graduate is obviously demonstrated in the way in which they engage in the world. It just is. And the choices they make and how they decide and think about futures and things like this. It just shapes. And yet the university does not, we in some ways treat people as adults, and in some ways we treat ourselves as in loco parentis. That is to say, the university has immense supporting structures as a way of trying to prevent 18, 19, 20-year-olds from doing things that are dangerous and harming themselves and others. That's part of our job, it seems to be. The third issue is simply trying to determine who gets to decide when a child is sufficiently mature. The parents who know the child well and live with the child and function with the child, or a physician who maybe have met the child one time in a very narrow circumstance. So I mean, you raise very interesting points about what's at stake and why it matters. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Another thing I'd like to disagree with you, I forgot to say, is that you imply that only boys drive recklessly. That's not true. I just want to tell you that I know women and girls who drive as bad as I do. So I just want to clarify that up front. Thank you. Thank you.
Before I pass the microphone over to our other discussants, I've got a short question wearing my ethicist hat. So it seems to me that my overall impression of the argument is that with all things being equal, it is more beneficial, or it is of a high utility to have families making decisions for adolescents. While your opponents seem to be arguing that regardless of what you've said, mature adolescents have an intrinsic right to make decisions for their own bodies and their own future. So, is there any possibility to argue from your perspective that the family is itself an intrinsic good, and while the autonomy of young adolescents is not necessarily an intrinsic good?
So amongst the things I do in that book I mentioned up there is I look at different ways in which we think about the family and what it is and its interests. And the very impressive role that the family plays in protecting the interests of family members, including health interests, adaptive interests for adolescents to develop, and so forth. And so what happens is the family routinely plays a very important role in the long-term success of adolescents. And insofar as one understands the family in a fairly traditional sense of having its own understanding of the good as this ontologically important social entity, then one then starts to rethink claims about rights of individuals, instead of thinking about the roles that the family plays with regard to helping those individuals do very successful things. So I think in terms of the family as an intrinsically valuable entity, even though we know that there are lots of imperfect families. But it just doesn't seem plausible to drive a wedge between parents and children when we have really good data showing the way in which families really do help children develop, to grow over time, to eventually learn how to be adults in very difficult circumstances. And because learning how to be an adult, y'all, is an arduous and difficult challenge. It takes time. The story I was telling just before we started was yesterday morning, as I got up, my phone rang. And it was my 25-year-old son calling me to help with a plumbing problem. Okay, so I walked him through the plumbing problem. He says, I think I understand, but I'm going to come over so we can talk more and you can show me. I said, well, that'll be a little bit difficult. He hadn't realized I'd left the Republic of Texas and come to Hong Kong. Right? Since I just answered the phone, he hadn't realized. I said, oh. He says, okay, we'll talk about it when you get back. Now, he's 25. He's a computer programmer. He's really smart. But there are areas of life that it's useful to have family around, even in our 20s and 30s and so forth. There are immense data showing the positives there. Yep.
Thanks a lot. James?
Well, I think there are obviously some mature adolescents, but then as Professor Leung said, there are also immature parents. So it may not be a good idea to have the parents to decide everything for the child, and some of the children are actually more mature than their parents, especially nowadays. The second point I want to make is it may not be the best solution to put the burden on the doctors either, because not all doctors are trained to assess the maturity of children. And on the other hand, as Professor Cherry pointed out, that the parents spend more time with their children and they know the children much better than a busy doctor in the office. So those are the 2 points I want to make.
Can I share my thoughts? Okay. So in fact, for our pediatricians' point of view, so actually, of course, for law is law. So the legal age for consent and also guilt competency, which the minor can also make them consent if their competencies is good enough to making consent. But practically, in fact, for our pediatricians, most of the time will also involve the parents, because as you know, parents are living with the child and also bringing them up, and then they understand their background, understand the stress of the child. And although sometimes adolescents, because when they get into adolescence, they try to have, they want to have their own decisions, they want to have their own autonomy, but there are also a lot of stress in their adolescence period. There are hormonal changes, they're more impulsive, etc. Of course, we will value their points of view, but it is also very important for the family to play a role in like discussing with them their point of view, because there are different angles in viewing one things. So most of the time, we will also involve the whole family to make decisions and make a joint consent. And sometimes even for like not adolescents, for younger age, like 6 years old or 7 years old, for those, for example, with precocious puberty, that we need a decisions, like central precocious puberty, we need decisions on whether they're injecting medicines so to delay their puberty. Sometimes, in fact, most of the time, I also encourage the parents to discuss also with the child, because they may have a little bit knowledge or they may have their own thoughts. So it's very important that we, the whole family, have a joint decisions. So during that way, in fact, for the parents, they will teach their child from very young how to make a good decision for themselves as well. So this is my view. But of course, there are cases that are very exceptional. That, for example, with parents that are very like that have child neglect or even abuse, and this is another issues. But of course, even for those cases, we want to have a better family dynamics. We will also try to figure out what is the family dynamics and what is the relationship between each of them, and also try to play a role in ensuring them to have a better family dynamics. But in that way, so of course we will treasure the child. If it is competence, we will treasure their thought more. But it is very important to have a joint consent. Then there will be support from the family as well, so that child, the adolescents will not have very stressful, and also she or he will have to bear the consequence. Because in the pediatric wards, we do see like a child, adolescents, they have their own like autonomy. For example, they decided to have unprotected sex with their boyfriend, but then subsequently they will come to our ward like crying, wanting us to involve. They are very scared. They may not already have a pregnancy, but they already regretted what they have already done. They decided to do that, but then they regret it. So we also will persuade them to also discuss with their family, because they need support. Even for our adult, when we make a decision, for example, even I grown up, I will discuss with my husband, or will discuss even my family. We need support from others. So for adolescents, they're in a even greater stress. Of course, they want to become an adult, to make their own decision, but they also still need some backup, be it the parents or some like they trusted teacher, etc. So usually we will try to give more time to them, and then communicate more, and then see whether they will involve other adults to have a joint decision with them, so that they will have a backup. Yeah, that's my thought.
Thank you very much, Queenie, for your insights. And I think could you provide us with the perspective of a young adult?
Yeah. So, as a former teenager, so I'll give an example of like an encounter in high school. So, like my friend would have like a girlfriend, and I would ask him, "Would you tell your parents that you have a girlfriend?" And he would say, "No way, my mom will kill me." And I think for a lot of adolescents, like they take that mindset to almost everything else, and including something like a medical clinical context. And sometimes we see on the news where boys, they go to the hospital with testicular torsion, and the testicles when it comes to the hospital, it's dead already. But like, how come boys are willing to not say anything about this condition, even though it's so painful? And partly the reason is because it's just embarrassing, and that you could say that it's almost like as if it's proving that adolescents are incapable of making a rational decision. But in the same way, it's also showing that adolescents go a very far way from being able to openly tell their parents about very sensitive issues or embarrassing or they're shy. And I think in Hong Kong, like children and parents aren't necessarily always that close, especially when there's a cultural gap and they have very different attitudes to certain topics. And the mature minor doctrine, or the ability to consent to your own healthcare, is a way to not corner a child, to not corner an adolescent from not being able to tell their parents and not being able to tell the doctor, or having nowhere to go. And I think that's what, I think that would be like in perspective of an adolescent, if that's a fair comment.
Thank you very much, Ivan. That's extremely helpful. I've received an interesting question from our online audience, one of our online audience. What should be done when both parents disagree with each other on what should be done? Please feel free to.
Maybe I'll answer this very quickly, because I'm going to present some PowerPoint slides, one of which will address this issue. So I'll do it later.
Yeah, you could do. Yeah, please do. Yeah. Please feel free to present your the position of Hong Kong. Thanks, James.
Sorry.
Yeah, maybe I just addressed Ivan points of view, because as we are like managing the PowerPoint. So as mentioned, we are all former teenager. So all this of embarrassments actually is usually is at that moment. So it is also at a period that you have to go through all the adolescence. When you become adult, you are not so embarrassing to talk about that, to share with your your close one, your loved one, is not that embarrassing. So it's also a moment that you have to go through in order to become adults, I think. Yeah, so.
And I think your mom wouldn't literally kill you if she knows you've got a boyfriend or girlfriend.
No,
James, please. Yes.
It's actually a good example of why you need parental support if you're sat worried about your parents going to kill you about having a girlfriend. And having doctrines that separate children from parents might actually cause, under those such circumstances, more harm than benefit.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think family-oriented consent, informed decision-making is ideal. But then we find children who are not in that ideal state, and they don't have the resources, they don't have the people to talk to, and yeah.
Okay. Yes. In a nutshell, I think what Professor Cherry has told us, present to us, is a kind of old-fashioned way of thinking about adolescent consent. And being an old-fashioned man, I agree with everything he said. The title of his talk was how the West did it wrong. So I'm going to present to you how do we do it right in the Oriental place, which is Hong Kong. And this is the Code of Professional Conduct published by the Middle Council of Hong Kong. This is a very thin booklet, but it contains a lot of information which all the doctors in Hong Kong should be familiar with. So the first thing is about the section 2 about consent to medical treatment. It started with the adult patients. And then section 2, subsection 12, it says about the child patients. So the first one is consent given by a child under the age of 18 years is not valid unless the child is capable of understanding the nature and implication of the proposed treatment. If the child is not capable of such understanding, consent has to be obtained from the child's parent or legal guardian. So this is pretty straightforward. And then the degree of maturity and intelligence required for a child to understand the nature and implications of the proposed treatment, which will depend upon the importance and complexity of the case. So not only the age and the maturity of the child, but also different cases are different. So if it is depends on the complexity of the case. It is the doctor's duty to ensure that the child is truly capable of such understanding before acting in reliance on the child's consent. This is more or less like the Gillick's competence. And this is putting the duty on the doctor to decide whether to accept it or not. So as I said, there's quite a burden on some doctors in some circumstances, especially in complex cases. And then, while a child may be competent to give valid consent, the child should be encouraged to involve the parents in the decision-making in respect of important or controversial procedures. So parents are not completely left out. So we have important or controversial procedures. And then the next subsection is, it is usually sufficient to have consent from one parent. However, in relation to major or controversial medical procedures, there may be the duty to consult the other parent. If the parent cannot agree and the dispute cannot be resolved, the doctor should seek legal advice as to whether it is necessary to apply to court for an order. So this answered the question raised from the web. So it's interesting that they use the word important or controversial and now major or controversial. So what's the difference between important and major? I don't know. It's not defined in the code. This will be my last slide. So a doctor should consider seeking legal advice if the parents refuse treatment which is clearly in the best interest of the child, particularly where the treatment is necessary to save the child's life or to prevent serious deterioration of the child's health. For example, blood transfusion for life-saving surgery. So if the doctor has any doubt, he may consider seeking legal advice and sometimes may have to get order from the court. Lastly, in exceptional situations such as emergency, parental neglect, abandonment of the child, and inability to find the parents, treatment without parental knowledge and consent may be justified. So this is the exception. So that is all I'm going to present from the Oriental point of view from Hong Kong. Thank you.
Would Professor Cherry want to comment on the Hong Kong position?
I'll only say a couple of small things because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a philosopher. The only bar at which I'm allowed to plead are the ones I order drinks or maybe convince others to buy them for me. And as a philosopher, in a strict sense, I'm not really interested in what the law is, other than as something I have to maneuver around at times to try to figure out how best to get what I want done and accomplished. And when you live in Texas, there's a lot of maneuvering that needs to happen. Right? But I will say hard cases make bad law. That's the usual sort of function. And so when looking at these kinds of structures, as I've been talking about it, it's not as if I pretend every family's perfect, and it's not as if I pretend that no adolescents are mature, but rather one always has to decide what's the default starting point, knowing full well there are going to be exceptions. Right? And then realizing you have to figure out how to handle exceptions. But if you treat the exceptions as the position, the default position, you then undermine really important aspects of life, which which there's immense data showing it constitutes to immense human good and value. And it's hard for me to see why we would want to have that be our default rather than knowing full well how to lay out accounts of how to really help people thrive and do well in the world. I mean, just as a couple of quickie notes, there's all kinds of data with regard to even adults about how much better they do when they're, in fact, living within a functioning family. Men in particular live longer if they're married, which is quite interesting and useful, right? With regard to adolescence, it's a way of, if you think of the family as a kind of a protective association, whose job in part it is to reach out and love and protect adolescents from the full force of the choices that they make. Because they get smart fast, and they are able to make all kinds of rational choices. It's in particular when there's a great deal of emotional sort of turmoil going on that it becomes difficult to make long-term decisions in one's good interest. It's one of those interesting impacts where they can very reliably look at a situation and say, that was a bad decision. I would never do that in those kinds of circumstances. And then the next night, in exactly the same kind of circumstances, do exactly the thing that they said they would never do, because they're now presented it in the real world. And it's just part and parcel of growing up, as you rightly point out. So that's the idea. Yeah.
I guess this answers other questions from our online audience about exceptions. For instance, exceptions relating to abusive parents. But personally, I think an exception proves the norm.